Okay, so we're going to spend some time talking about first words and word combinations, and just like other aspects of language development that we've talked about in these audio lectures, the onset of first words is just a really, really important developmental point in a young child's journey. When we think about when first words emerge, we typically think about a year as being the most average point in time. We will sometimes see children developing words a little bit earlier than that. The research and different developmental charts say about 8 to 16 months, but I think for most children we see it right about that 12-month age period. And what we see happening with first words is that there's lots of other things happening in the child's life around that first birthday. So in terms of motor, we're seeing kids learning to walk at that time so they can explore the world more. From a cognitive perspective, research shows that children are starting to organize and store information more efficiently, and so the way they're looking at the world is becoming more varied, and also from a social perspective, we're seeing that children are able to comment on items in their environment, inquire about objects. As you know, gestural language is solidly being used at this point in time, and so all of these are some of the related behaviors that surround that first word development. In terms of how many words we expect at different age ranges, we think about, from a productive perspective, how children are using words, that around 12 months, again, we see those first words, or whole first word, but a really lot of growth happens in that next 6 months to 12 months time period. So at about 18 to 24 months, we're looking at children to have 50 to 200 words. And again, these are relevant references and like a metric for which we look at when we think about trying to identify children who might have some delays if they're not acquiring 50 words, for example, by 2 years of age. And then we see growth really, really expand in a very significant rate. So for a 3-year-old, we expect them to have about 900 to 1,000 words, and the research shows that in preschool, children add about 2 to 5 words per day, with children around 5 having about 2,200 words, and at 6 years of age would expect about 14,000 words. Not that we are counting on either speech-language pathologists or educators or anything else, thankfully. There are some really consistent characteristics of first words, and the first bullet talks about first words initially being non-referential. Truthfully, if a word is non-referential, then it's not truly a word. I wanted to reference this point in regards to the fact that sometimes babies will say things like mama and dada, which is actually a phonological representation of a real item in our environment, but they're not specifically utilizing that phonological form to represent mama or dada. That's more of canonical babbling, and we've talked in class about the fact that part of the reason that mama and dada words are similar, associated kinds of word combinations around the world is because those are the early phonological forms that babies produce, and of course parents have looked at that over time and said, hey, that's me, mama, made that a connection for children. But the first mama and dada is not truly referring to actually parents, as we know. But despite differences in language, we see that there's a lot of similarity about the first words that children produce across languages. And again, that's connecting to what they're able to do with their articulators and the phonological forms that they produce. We know that with first words, they may come and go for children in terms of as they may lose interest in a referent in an item, and so just because they're producing it at a point in time doesn't mean they're going to have that word for the long term, at least for the first word perspective. We do see that words that are easiest to produce are acquired first, and that makes sense that a baby is producing phonological forms that are easy for their articulators to produce, such as mama and dada. We see first words having lots of front sounds, so typically first words contain B, P, M, T, N, or D. And we typically see words having 1 or 2 syllables, like ba or baba, but not a combination of consonant, vowel, consonant like dog. We don't see that CVC as being represented very commonly in very first words. And then we see children developing a core group of words, and so the research shows that within the first 50 words that they learn, they tend to use 8 or 10 frequently. And in that very early development, right at that first birthday when those first words develop, we see initially that word learning is very slow. We also see that there are varied classes that first words represent. On page 230 of your text, it talks about, I'm sorry, it's not 230, let me get it, it is page 234, talks about varied grammatical classes of first words, and they include things like nominal specific, which is just referring to a unique category, like mama, dada, nana, a very specific referent. Also includes nominal general, which is just a word that represents items in a category. We look at action words. Go, ride, up, play were examples of action words. Modifiers describe the features or qualities of objects or events. So words like mine, big, dirty. Personal social words, no, hi, bye-bye, and functional words with grammatical functions, what, where, etc. And you don't need to memorize those different grammatical categories, but it's important that you're aware of what they are. And we know that for children's first words, they include a variety of those grammatical classes, but about approximately 50 to 65% of first words are nouns. And often these items represent animals, food, toys in terms of the first words that children are producing. And we also know that in those first words, they are representing sounds from babbling and jargon. So a child who's babbling a lot of consonant vowel with M, B, D, for example, that tends to be the phonological sounds that are represented in their first words. The research shows that there's some varied types of learners, and this isn't a dichotomy that it's always a child is referential or expressive, but there's some trends to show that there are some children are referential learners, meaning that they tend to lean towards learning nouns in their first repertoire of words that they're producing, in comparison to expressive language learners, which tend to lean more towards social words, up, hi, bye, those kinds of things. And they attribute these different kinds of learners just based really a function of varied learning style. So a child who learns a lot of nouns, maybe a child who does a lot of pointing and getting a lot of commenting and labeling from parents, for example, and compared to expressive, who tend to be more social in the words that they're learning and the ways that they're interacting with the world. We also see very early on a really strong relationship between first words and the words that mothers are using in the environment. This isn't represented on a long-term basis, but in the very first words, we do see that represented. And we also see that early word learning often develops around daily routines. So kids are learning words to talk about the kinds of items and activities that they're interacting with on a daily basis, which makes complete sense. And if we think about what makes a word a true word, one of the variables is that there's a phonetic relationship to an adult word. And so we see, when we think about what a true word is, we believe that it has to have a phonological form that is similar to an adult word. It doesn't have to be exact, so a child who does some sort of a modification of that adult word doesn't make it a non-word, but there needs to be some similarity. Another component of a true word is that it's used consistently. So if a child has a phonological form, they're always making that connection of that phonological representation to that item. And that item, that word, also typically occurs in the presence of a referent. And so a child who's labeling words like ball or mama is producing that word when the actual object is around. Although, of course, some of those first words can be social words like hi and by, but also in response to being socially interactive. And just a note here about proto-words and phonetically consistent forms. People sort of argue whether a proto-word or a phonetically consistent form is a true word, and what that is a child who has created a phonological representation to represent the adult word, but it may not sound very much like the adult word. So, for example, sometimes you'll have children who utilize a name for a person. Maybe the sister's name is Elizabeth, and they're not able to produce that, and they produce something else like Isby. You know, there's not a lot of commonality between Isby and Elizabeth, but if it's how the child is able to produce it, oftentimes what we see is they do it consistently. It's phonetically consistent. It's always used in reference to Sister Elizabeth, but doesn't quite meet that criteria of the phonetic relationship to an adult word. These phonetically consistent forms, even though they are varied in terms of how well they represent that word phonologically, are really important because what they're showing us is that the child has the capability of representing an item with a phonological form in their mind, to store it and to use it consistently. And so they have that symbolic representation of a phonological form for a referent in their world. And here's a sample of just some first words from my own daughter's early development. She's a teenager now, but I kept a little diary, and so you can see there are some personal social words there, high, up, more, but lots of reference related to objects in the environment. Okay. Oh, and this is just the table of what I had talked about earlier in terms of the grammatical classes that are represented in first words: nominal, specific, general, action words, modifiers, personal, social, and functional. We see children making first word errors in their productions, and there's some true reasons for why that is. First word errors that we see children doing some overextensions, and what this is the child is representing ideas that are beyond the adult concept of an item. So, for example, a child who calls all things with 4 feet a dog. We might call a horse a dog early on, or a cow a dog early on. The belief there that reason of why that is happening is that there's it may be a strategy because the child doesn't have a word yet to represent different animals, for example. And a lot of times we know that it's not really an essence of confusion, meaning that if you're asked the child to show me cow versus dog versus horse, often they can do that receptively, but that it's really a strategy to be able to utilize some kind of a phonological word form when they don't have a word for all items. Another kind of first word error that we see is underextensions, and that's when words are only used to refer to a subset of the contexts that are allowed by an adult. So, for example, a child may call only a dog in their own house the word dog or representation of dog, but out and about see other kinds of dogs and not make that connection. That word really has a broader contextual category of like the schema of dogness. And again, this is something that we see develop early on before a child has had maybe a lot of experience with that word and referring to those different items. People also talk about the idea that this could be an issue of word retrieval as well. I'm going to do the next slides in a different audio lecture. Thank you.